Hello, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Hassan, and today I'm going to be giving a talk on how to stay sane while managing complex states in Vue.js. So this morning we had 2 talks about state management, and they were super, super cool. But this particular talk will be slightly involved within the Vue framework, but can pretty much be adapted to any framework or library that you use. As mentioned, I'm from the most beautiful city in the world, Toronto, Canada. I think I'm the only person from Toronto here. Are there any other Canadians by any chance? No other Canadians. Wow, the only one. Anyway, I graduated as an engineer from the University of Toronto. I joined Deloitte Digital, which is basically a digital agency of a consulting group right after, and this is where I started to help clients build and scale their front-end applications. And today I'm a front-end developer for the commerce company known as Shopify. So we all know what Vue is, so I won't spend too much time here. And Chris yesterday had a great keynote talking about how cool it is. But as a quick summary, Vue is the progressive JavaScript framework that is approachable, versatile, and performant. And there's a lot we can unpack here. But today, we're going to focus on one particular topic, which is state management, which is a precursor to understanding what the Vuex library is, or why we even need it in the first place. So we'll start from the very beginning. Vue components. Like other front-end frameworks, Vue components are basically coupled units of functionality that allow us to group markup, logic, and styles. In Vue, there's pretty much one of 2 ways of defining a Vue component. In standalone simple Vue apps, you can create a new component by stating Vue.component, and specifying the name of the component as the first argument, and then declaring the options that the component contains. In pre-compiled Vue applications, you can actually define components in single file format. This gives you the advantage of defining your markup in a template section, your logic in a script section, and even your styles in a style section. But whether we're defining our components globally or through single file format, we have to understand at some point, how do we actually want to manage data in our application? This is a super broad topic, so we'll start off very simple. Assume this is a hypothetical app, and all we have at first is a single parent component and a single child component. And all we want to do is pass data from the parent down to the child. Like other front-end libraries, Vue gives us the ability to use props to do this. We'll spend a very little time explaining how that works, but let's assume we have a parent component that's being rendered, and its template is rendering another component called child component. As it's rendering the child component, it's passing a prop labeled event. This event prop is given a string value of framework S or framework summit. Now, the child component, for it to use the props that's been given to it, has to declare the prop in a props attribute. It then uses the mustache syntax to bind that prop onto its template. So this is basically using 2 components to display a single header element that says hello framework S or hello framework summit. Super straightforward. And regardless of how big our app becomes, using props to pass data downwards pretty much remains the same. But what if we wanted to have a way to find the child component basically notify the parent to change something? We can't use props at all here. To have communication in the opposite direction, we can use something known as custom events. So Vue custom events behave very similar to native JavaScript custom events, but there's one key distinction. Vue custom events are primarily used for communication between components as opposed to communication between DOM nodes. So let's go through a very brief example of this as well. On the left-hand side here, we have a child component that's rendering a header element. This header element has a click event listener denoted by the @click syntax, and that basically says when the user clicks this header element, it's going to call a change speaker method. This change speaker method is going to use the component's events interface to fire a custom event, this.emit, and the name of the custom event is change speaker. In addition, this particular component expects a speaker prop that's being bound onto its template. Now, on the parent component side, where the child component is being rendered, exists a custom event listener, and that's denoted by the @change_speaker syntax. And that basically says when the change speaker event is fired within the child, the listener gets triggered on the parent side and calls the parent's change speaker method. The parent's change speaker method changes its data property from Hassan, speaker data property from Hassan to Evan. So this is basically seeing a single header element and using custom events and props to change how the information is actually being displayed. In addition, we can actually pass data within our custom events. We could have passed an object that had a name property that the listener can actually use. But at the end of the day, between a single parent and child component, props and custom events can pretty much do everything you want. But then what if we wanted to introduce another component, which is a child of the parent, but a sibling to the first child component? If we wanted to have data from the parent down to this child, we'll use props as well. But what if we wanted basically the 2 different child components to sort of communicate or pass information between one another? What do we actually do here? Can we use custom events? Well, not the way we've shown, because this simple custom event is actually being fired within the interface of the component, and as a result, the listener has to be declared where that component is being rendered. 2 different sibling components, one isn't being rendered within the other, so we have to think of a different way of doing this. So this is the moment, literally, people take a step back and think, how do we actually want to manage data in our app as we start to introduce more and more components in our application? There's roughly 3 main ways within the Vue framework. You can use a global event bus, you can use a simple form of state management, or you can use the Flux-like library Vuex. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about points 1 and 2 before diving into what Vuex is and why it's helpful. So what is an event bus? An event bus is a Vue instance that's used to enable isolated components to subscribe and publish custom events between one another. But didn't we just say that's sort of not possible? Well, an event bus makes this possible. An event bus is just a new Vue instance. Vue components are Vue instances. Every Vue instance has its own custom events interface. An event bus is a Vue instance that's made global, like attaching it to the window object, or more probably creating an instance of it somewhere, which allows now other components that depend on it. So let's assume we have an event bus available in our application, and we're going to have 2 sibling components work together. The first sibling component has an emit event method. And this emit event method, when triggered through any means, uses the event bus event interface to fire a custom event. Now, the other unrelated component is going to create the listener programmatically. And a good place to do this is within the created lifecycle hook of the component. Created basically says whenever the component gets created for the very first time, this hook gets run. So we're saying when this other component gets created, we're going to attach a listener event bus on to that particular event. So whenever the first event gets fired from anywhere or from this component, that callback function will actually get fired and a console log message will be triggered. So that answers the question we had in mind. Between the 2 different child or sibling components, an event bus does the job. This isn't wrong, and this actually works, but there's one particular problem. Applications usually look a lot more complicated, and this is sort of my way of basically saying sometimes applications have a lot more components. So let's assume here that all these white lines are props as being passed down. And we wanted component 1.1 on the bottom left to sort of communicate with the parent. It will fire an event, and the parent will declare the listener. What if component 1.2 needed to do the same thing? That would happen as well. If components 2 and 3 needed to communicate with one another, you see what's starting to happen here, right? Though incredibly easy to set up, things get hard to track really, really quickly. Like an event bus takes 2 lines to create, but nothing can be tracked. We can just fire events anywhere and declare listeners where we want to. And if you look at the Vue.js style guide, it's actually recommended to not use an event bus for application-wide state management. I'll go a little further now saying an event bus isn't really state management. It's just the firing events and listening for it anywhere else. So let's move away from that and look at another simple form of state management. Now, we've been saying this quite a bit, so let's actually reiterate what state management is. It's the management of application-level data. Now, this might sound obvious, but application-level data in this sense is pretty much data that needs to be shared throughout your application. Component-level data, on the other hand, is basically data that needs to be kept within a particular component. So that isn't part of our state management process. So now, all Vue applications, for the most part, usually have an uppermost parent component that's being rendered. So why don't we just have all the data in our app that we need up in this parent component? We can use props to pass it down to all the children that need it. Is there a way we can have the children just notify the parent to change the data values that they depend on? And thanks to Vue's reactivity system, those child components will then get re-rendered to show the change. Well, we can sort of do this without custom events. And one way we can do this is instead of having everything within a particular component, we can externalize this to something we can call the store. The store can just be an object that contains 2 main properties. It contains the state of your application. In this particular example, let's assume the talk I'm giving right now is some information we need in our app. And it should also contain the methods or mutations responsible in directly changing the state properties. So let's say we have a change speaker method that expects a payload and is directly going to update the state speaker value with that payload. So assume we have the store on the top left corner available to us, and we'll see how 2 components sort of work together. Component A here just wants to retrieve data from the state. So what it's going to do is basically create a local shared state property which is equal to the store state object. And in its template, it's just going to bind the speaker value to its template. This speaker is Hassan Djirdeh. Now, component B is going to actually change what component A is displaying, but it's not going to do anything to component A. It's going to have a method of its own, like change speaker, and it's going to call the store change speaker method. The store change speaker method takes a payload, so we can pass in a string, like something like James Bond. And that pretty much can do what we actually intend to do. But the important thing here that I really want to reiterate is when we say component A and component B works together, they're not doing anything at all to each other. Component B calls the store method, and component A depends on the store, so it'll get updated to show the change. Something that was talked about today that I would love to reiterate here is, from those who come from a React or a Redux background, this is pretty foreign. So in Vue, and whatever state management process we run in Vue, state is treated as reactive. We can directly change the state value, and components that depend on these state values will be re-rendered to show the change. Data isn't treated as immutable. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but I love this approach because it's a lot easier to sort of wrap your head around. Now, the second thing isn't something that's apparent, but something that sort of has to be enforced. If we want the state management process to be more manageable than, let's say, an event bus, we want to actually have a conscious effort of keeping all our state mutations within the store. This allows you and anyone else looking at your store to sort of understand that, okay, this is all the state that your application needs and all the methods or mutations that your application needs. We can introduce a change talk method, a change event method, etc., etc. So now when we go back to our hypothetical application or this hypothetical blueprint, things get a lot better. We don't have custom events being sporadically emitted everywhere anymore. We don't have to rely on props to pass all the data down. We could in certain cases, but in other cases, we can now have our components depend on this external store. So now let's take a look at this particular example we've had and now focus on the pieces that directly interact with the store. So component B on the bottom right, its method has a particular responsibility at the very end. Its responsibility is to call or act on the store change speaker method. So we can say it's a store action. The store change speaker method has a single responsibility as well. At the end of the day, it wants to mutate or change store state. So we can say that this is a store action committing to a store mutation. Component A, once again, doesn't care about exactly what component B is doing or what exactly the store method does. It just wants to get values from the store. So we can say it's a store getter. So now we have an action committing to a mutation, and we have a getter basically retrieving information for us that gets updated when that information gets changed. If we think about it, this gets very close to the Flux-like architecture of managing application states, which brings us close to Vuex for Vue applications. So what is Vuex? Vuex is the Flux-like state management library built solely for use with Vue. Now, for those who may not be unaware or aware of Flux, I'll go through a very brief example of this. Flux is basically a pattern created by Facebook. It's a design pattern that's composed of 4 parts organized as a one-way data pipeline. You have an action, dispatcher, store, view. The view are components basically dispatch actions. Actions can commit or dispatch mutations, whatever the terminology you're familiar with. Mutations mutate store state, and components that depend on the state gets re-rendered. So Vuex is a library. It needs to be explicitly introduced into your application. This can be done through NPM, Yarn, or Content Delivery Network. And for module-based apps, Vuex has to be explicitly installed. We can do this by saying view.vuex, where view is an import of the Vue library, and Vuex is an import of the Vuex library. Now, the heart of a Vuex integration is the Vuex store. The Vuex store can be created by saying new vuex.store and passing in the options that the store expects. There are 4 options in total that makes a store complete: state, mutations, actions, and getters. State and mutations have to be introduced to actually create your Vuex store. Now, actions and getters don't have to be introduced, but they pretty much make your store complete. And like how the Vuex store is the heart of a Vuex integration, the Vue instance is the heart of a Vue application. The Vue instance is or the root level Vue instance, where we basically declare the DOM element our Vue app is going to be mounted upon, as well as the uppermost parent component that's going to be rendered. To have your store available everywhere in your application, it needs to be explicitly introduced into a Vue instance. So now let's talk about each of the pieces within a Vuex store. We've talked about state before, and that pretty much remains the same within Vuex. It's just an object that contains the details of the app or the data of the app that you actually want. We'll stick with the example that we had before. Now, mutations are functions responsible in directly mutating store state. In Flux architectures, mutation handlers are often denoted in capital letters. Here we have an update speaker mutation. Now, in Vuex, mutations always have access to state as their first argument. In addition, they may or may not have access to a payload, depending on if something that calls or commits to mutation passes in that payload. Here we have an update speaker mutation that expects a payload and is going to update the speaker value from the state to that payload. Actions exist to call mutations, but in addition, in Vuex, actions are responsible in performing any or all asynchronous calls prior to committing to a mutation. Here we have an update speaker action. Now, like mutations, actions have access to a unique object right away. But in this case, they have access to an object often known as the context object. Context provides access to a few different things. It provides access to your store state with context.state. It provides access to your store getters with context.getters. And provides access to the commit function with context.commit. We'll assume for this particular example, we don't need access to state or getters, and we're only going to use the commit function. Now, as mentioned, actions are responsible in performing any or all asynchronous calls. So we'll just say for this example that we need to make some form of GET request. We'll use Axios as an example, but any HTTP library can be used. We'll say make a GET request to this particular route, and only upon success of this particular request, we'll use the context.commit function to commit to the update speaker mutation. We'll then also pass in the payload that mutation expects. Let's just say the first item of the speaker array from the response object is what we want to pass. And the last piece of a Vuex store is the getters. Now, getters are to a Vuex store what computer properties are to a Vue component. Computer properties in a Vue component basically compute data information within the component prior to having that information available in the template. Getters play a very similar role in Vuex. It basically allows us to create functions that allow us to basically manipulate state values prior to having these values available in our components. This is why getters don't have to be used. You can just simply compute state values if you want. Here we have a very simple get speaker getter that returns the speaker value from our state. And like mutations, getters always have access to state as the first argument. So now what do components do with a very built Vuex store? They literally do one of two things. They either get state data with getters or state, or they simply dispatch actions. A well-built Vuex store pretty much takes care of everything else. So here we're going to have a single file component as an example, and we're going to see how it interacts with the store that we just talked about. In the template exists a header element. This header element has a click event listener that says when the user clicks it, it calls an update speaker method in our components. In addition, we're binding a get speaker data value into our component. In the script section, we can export the component, give it the name of speaker components, and in the computer property, we have the get speaker property that's being bound on the template. This get speaker computer property simply returns the get speaker getter, the value of the get speaker getter in our store. It does this by saying return this.store.getters.getSpeaker. Now notice how we're referencing the store, this.$store. This is the injected store object available everywhere in our application. How is it available everywhere in our application? We had to explicitly introduce it into our Vue instance. Now, in the method side of things, we see something very similar. The update speaker method simply dispatches the update speaker action in our store. When triggered, it just says this.store.dispatch update speaker. Now, oftentimes, you may find yourself reiterating this.store quite often. So what Vuex actually does provide is helpers to make things a little less verbose. We can use something like the map getters and map actions helpers. So if you look at the computer and the methods areas, we're using the map getters helpers to simply map the get speaker getter in our store to a get speaker computer property of the same name in our component. And we're doing something very similar for our methods with map actions. At the end of the day, we're just simply mapping information from our store directly to our components one-to-one. It's the same example as before. So now what actually happens when the user interacts with our UI? So initially, the user sees the speaker as Hassan Djirdeh because that's the data value in our state. And the user is tired. He says, you know what? I don't want Hassan anymore. I want someone else. The user clicks his header element. And the first thing that happens is the update speaker method is triggered in the component. This method dispatches the update speaker action in our store. The update speaker action is then basically called and it makes the asynchronous call. And only when the call is successful, then commits to the update speaker mutation. Let's assume the data or the payload we're passing in is a string that says JSON born. That update speaker mutation then takes the payload and updates the state speaker value with that payload. And finally, the user finally sees what they intend to see. Now, for people who may not have been counting, that's almost or pretty much 4 steps to simply have a single async call to change a particular data value. So you may be wondering, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But that can pretty much be why Vuex extends a simple store mindset. Vuex essentially is more advantageous, I guess, than a simple store because it introduces explicitly defined getters, mutations, and actions. We want to introduce these explicit steps throughout our pipeline so we can track where things may potentially go wrong or where things are always going to go right. This is literally the adaptation of the Flux-like architecture. We want to have all these steps throughout our app. Now, another huge advantage to using Vuex is that Vuex integrates with the Vue dev tools for time travel debugging. Now, for those who don't know what the Vue dev tools is, I'll go through a very brief example. This is a shopping cart application I built a while back. It's super simple. It basically has a shopping cart area and products list, and when the user adds items to the cart, it persists these items to a local server. Now, the Vue dev tools is a Chrome extension or a Firefox add-on that brings us really useful capabilities for debugging our app. So right away, we can see all the components in our application, and within particular components, we can see the data and the props being passed through to see all the information we have. So Vuex extends or integrates automatically with the Vue DevTools to allow us to basically track every single mutation that happens in our UI. And the cool thing is we can actually go to a particular mutation, see the state, getters, and mutation information for the store at that very moment. And oftentimes people think this isn't possible unless data is treated as immutable, but the Vue DevTools show that it's totally possible with reactive data. And a really, really cool thing is we can time travel our UI back to a particular mutation to see how the UI looked at that very moment. So I don't have a lot more time left, but one thing I'm going to continue talking about is how can we, sort of grow this as our application continues to grow. So assume for the shopping cart application, initially, we had this as the main folder structure. We had the app folder, components basically had the cart and product folders, and initially, our store is being created within a store index file. So this store index file initially basically had the state object, mutations, actions, and getters, and it basically exported and created the Vuex store. This worked just as well. But what if I found that, hey, there was a large number of mutations or state properties or actions, and I wanted to find a way to basically think of how can I break this down to smaller pieces? Well, one thing that Vuex allows us to do is use something known as Vuex modules because it allows us to break our store into more manageable fragments. A Vuex module is essentially just simply an object that contains the properties of the store. So we could, for example, have a cart module and a product module, and each of these modules can have the objects that pertain to itself. Its own state, its own mutations, its own actions, its own getters. And all we have to do is pass these modules within a modules property in our store. Now, why is this helpful or cool? Because now we don't have to worry about thinking of having a single store index file. We can break things down a little further. We can have a store cart index, a store product index, and each of these indices can have their own modules being created. Now, if a particular piece within our store is just large enough that's giving us a headache, we can remove it to separate files as well. Now, what I'm trying to say here is not that this is the only way of doing things. It's completely up to you. But at the end of the day, even though Vuex sort of makes us follow a particular strict pattern to managing our states, we can break our store into pieces that we like to see fit. Now, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the idea of domain-driven design or domain-driven UI application building, but something I tend to try to follow for UI building and basically say, let me build my UI in pieces that represent different business domains for my app. So for the shopping cart, let's just say the cart domain and the product domain are two different domains that have their own data, their own components. I can use modules to sort of facilitate that. And if my boss came up to me and was like, Hassan, I need a brand new feature, logging in capabilities, authentication for that shopping cart. We need to spice this up. I'd be like, okay, that doesn't really fit within the cart or product modules because it's going to have its own data system. I'm just going to introduce a brand new user module that has its own actions, getters, and mutations. My store pretty much remains the same. It's just going to bring that module back in. And what about shared functionality? What about functionality that doesn't necessarily fit within a particular module? You can put in a shared module if you want. It's completely flexible. And that's my point. My point is, at the end of the day, even though things seem somewhat stricter with Vuex, it is malleable to how you sort of want to architect things. It's not that complicated. And a very important thing to keep in mind, though, is Vuex, at the end of the day, is supposed to make your application more maintainable. If it's giving you more of a headache, if it's making things more complicated, you either don't need it, or you might be doing things in ways that might be simplified over time. And finally, it has to be manageable. And that sort of ties into what I just said right now. If it's not manageable as your application starts to grow and it doesn't actually maintain your app over time, there may be other ways to look at certain things. So that sort of concludes what I had to say today. We talked about three main ways of managing data within a Vue application: an event bus, a simple store mindset, or Vuex. Now, a very common question would be like, what is the correct way or what is the wrong way? I don't like talking in absolutes, and I'll pretty much say that each of these methods have their advantages and disadvantages. An event bus is so easy to set up, and it's really, really useful for prototyping, but you can't track anything at all. Simple store is actually relatively easy to set up as well, but getters and mutations and actions aren't explicitly defined. Vuex is the most robust way of doing things, but it comes with additional boilerplates, and you have to have this understanding of a simple Flux-like mindset to actually make it work. Now, for further reading, if you do actually want to dive in a little bit more, I highly encourage you to look at the Vue and Vuex documentation. Documentation within the Vue ecosystem is known to be probably one of the best in my opinions, and I can't really specify how good these are in terms of examples, so feel free to get to actually going through these. If you want to see exactly what I sort of talked about today, I have an article called Managing State in Vue.js. It pretty much goes through exactly what I talked about with some different examples and some running code. And as a separate plug, if you're interested in learning how to build Vue applications, I did publish a book earlier this year called Full Stack Vue, The Complete Guide to Vue.js. So if you want another resource into learning Vue, this is a potential opportunity. And before I end it, I do want to mention that if any of you is interested in my day job, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I work in Shopify, as mentioned. I'm part of the app and partner platform team. And I'm basically focused on building the UI that Shopify partners and Shopify developers work on. My day job is actually mostly React. I use a little bit of Rails at the back end. I do Vue everything outside of my day job. That pretty much concludes what I had to say, and it was 20 seconds left, so I'm happy about that. That's my Twitter handle, Djirdeh. I'm trying to step on my Twitter game, so do, message me, follow me, good feedback, bad feedback. That's my LinkedIn if anybody still uses LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.